Welcome to install a local Microsoft Server 2019 virtual machine, part 2, 11 September 2020. One of the most important considerations before installing a server role on a standalone server, is to establish a fixed IP network address and a unique name that remains unchanged for the life of the server. So we want to establish a unique host name that works in a variety of named resource contexts across a network, whether we're dealing with UNCs or network map drives, LAN manager names, that kind of thing. We also want to make sure that the network address for the server is statically assigned so that it doesn't change, because once the role is set up, it's going to cause a problem. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and log in to our virtual machine. This is the second part. If you haven't taken it up to the point where you've installed the server in the virtual machine environment using VirtualBox, review part 1. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my administrator account, and it's considered good practice to change that so that normally you would not log in with that administrator account or that default account. I'm going to remove the task view button just because I want less on the side. For our local machine, if you're in a home environment using wireless access point, home wireless, the chances are pretty good that your wireless access router, your wireless router, is issuing a private internal address range to devices. You see here the typical address pool for DHCP for a home wireless unit is 50 addresses, and I'm using 32, 192.168.50.32, and this is a /24 subnet, which means that this is the network ID. 192.168.50.0 is the network ID for this particular wireless network. And what I'm going to do is pin a static IP address outside the possible range of IP address leases, and I want to be well outside that range so that you don't have an IP address conflict, and we don't want that changing. So on my virtual machine, inside my virtual machine, I'm operating in bridged mode. I'm going to check on the local server option from the server manager dashboard to expose the Ethernet address options. I'm going to go ahead and click on this, double click on the interface, open properties. I'm going to disable IPv6. I'm going to double click on TCP/IP version 4, and I'm going to insert my own static IP address, 192.168.50.201. So that's probably 100 addresses higher. It's not likely that's going to change. My local default gateway is 192.168.50.1. I'll use two common DNS addresses so I can make sure that I have internet connectivity. So we'll go ahead and click OK and close. And if I refresh, we should see this changed, no longer dynamically assigned. That's important. I also want to change the time zone. I'm not West Coast, even though Microsoft is Seattle. And for our purposes, we'll select Georgetown, La Paz, Manaus, and San Juan. uh, for our local campus. And then that way we're in the right time zone. Another thing that I'm going to do is browse a little bit just to get specific utilities and other things. I'm going to turn off the Internet Explorer Enhanced Security configuration for administrative logins, but for regular user logins, I'm going to leave it in place. And that's going to prevent a lot of problems when I start browsing. The computer name is randomly assigned when you first install Server 2019. And here you see it's a random, and because it's standalone, it's a standalone server, and the security account management is local. It's not a part of a domain. The default workgroup name is workgroup. This is terrible for security purposes. We want to make sure that we change the default workgroup name as well as the computer name. So I'm going to click on computer name. It's going to open up system properties, and I'm going to change this. I'll assign a specific simple computer name. We'll call it Frodo. And I'm going to create a work group called Lord of Rings, right? Themed after the Lord of the Rings series. So we'll call it Lord of Rings. I'll make it LOR for short. That's not as obvious. And I'll click OK. It'll prompt me that I need to reboot the system in order for these to change effect. And at that point, I'll be ready to get out on the server manager to use the dashboard to install the roles. We're going to pause the recording while we reboot. Welcome to the workgroup. It says I have to reboot. While it's rebooting, we'll pause recording. So we've restarted the system, and Server Manager is opening up. One of the most useful things that we can do with this VirtualBox Server 2019 installation is to install the VirtualBox extensions. But if I want to double check to make sure the name change and the IP address are in place, I can see that basically there's a new work group called LOR, and the computer name is established, something common and easy to remember. So if I have to navigate across a network, that's simple. I have a fixed IP address. I'm in the right time zone. So we're ready to use the dashboard to install a role, but having more screen real estate on a server to work multiple screens is important. Don't forget, in devices, you can install the Guest Editions CD image, and this will prompt you to open a preference on what to do with this. I'm just going to go ahead and open the folder to view the files because I want to right-click and run as admin, and I can't do that from here. I'll minimize my server manager for the time being, and I will right-click and run as administrator so that the VirtualBox extensions, hardware extensions, will set up properly. I'm going to go ahead and accept default settings and install. And this will allow me to change the screen resolution and work with thumb drives and a variety of other things. I'll accept that, I'll click install that I trust VirtualBox extensions, and that's the first indication that something is working right. And it says I need to reboot. I'm going to choose to reboot simply because I want all of this to take effect, and I want bigger and more legible screen real estate to work with as I continue the configuration for my role setup. I'm going to go ahead and click finish and let it reboot. We'll pause the recording again. So we've restarted the system. Server Manager opened up, but I went to the View menu and selected Adjust Window Size and then maximized the virtual machine window, and you can see I have a much larger screen display to work with. So I have a 1600 by 770. My native laptop screen is 1600 by 900. If I right click and go into taskbar settings and auto hide my taskbar on the laptop on my host, basically I can maximize the use of the screens. Can also increase the size of the text as it appears in the virtual machine. That's really helpful for a lot of things we're trying to do. So to add a role or a feature in a standalone server, as Server Manager comes up, after all your Windows updates have been installed, after you've optimized the server by disk cleanup and disk defrag, and then setting a permanent swap file. Let's review that real quick. You're going to add roles and features and then run updates and patches and fixes again, because the functionality of the server and the services that it runs locally will change, and that'll trigger a series of changes for updates. So if it becomes a web server, there will be patches and fixes and updates for the Microsoft Internet Information Service, the web server. We'll go ahead and show you some of those optimization features later, but let's finish adding roles and features. It's a wizard-driven process. It's going to give you some basic information before we start. You click Next. We want a role-based installation, not a remote desktop services installation. If we wanted to convert this standalone server to remote desktop services and host remote desktops, provided we had paid the money for all the additional licenses, we could choose this second option. But in most cases, you're just going to accept the role-based installation. We're going to click Next. This console can be used to manage and install roles on a variety of servers, but in the default settings with a new installation, you should see the name of your server listed here. You're going to accept that. We're not dealing with a server pool. We're not managing multiple role installations, but we could do that if we wanted to. For our purposes, we're going to simulate a useful role to install DNS. I'm going to click on this box, and you'll see here that it's including additional features. Once DNS is installed as a role, it's going to also install administration tools for DNS. So I'm going to add these features. It's also a good idea to open up file and storage services and expand those all the way. If you're using your standalone server to share files, you probably want to check the file server option. You may also choose server for NFS if you're using your standalone server to connect with Internet of Things, any Linux-based intelligent devices. It's always useful to have NFS file sharing capabilities in your server. I'm going to add these features. You see it's also adding the administrative tools for network file share and for regular file server services. I'm going to click Next. I don't need to check any other boxes, but it's not bad to look at what other features can be added once those roles are selected. So here you see that I could install a client for NFS, or I could install other DNS related features. I'm going to accept the defaults. I'm going to click Next, and I'm going to check the box that says Restart the destination server automatically if required. It'll say if a restart is required, the server restarts automatically without additional notifications. Do you want to allow this? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to click install. So if you're a student in CSE 410, Principles of Operating Systems, since we're integrating Linux into an Active Directory context, eventually we'll be joining the domain. And as a starting role installation, it would be a good idea to install DNS and to install file and storage services, including NFS and the basic file server role on your system. And then that way you can use your standalone virtual machine at your home while you're connected on the internet to work some of the solutions and some of the assignments. Even though you're not on your domain server, you can try some things out before you go on the class domain and interact with systems from others in the class. We'll pause this until the process completes. When your role installation, once your roles have been installed, you'll notice the screen changes and it says installation succeeded on Frodo. You can close, and now the Server Manager dashboard will look different. You'll see a DNS option here on the dashboard, and file and storage services for the local server will also show, and they'll be lit in a green and functional status. What we had before was in red because it hadn't been set up. So even though file server was there, it hadn't been configured. You'll see a notification that says installation succeeded. It's always good to clear that so that when you have a flag and a number there, you know that the system is trying to tell you something.